5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff.
Welcome to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Co-pilot Pearson and I are on our summer break. But to help keep you sane, dear Planet Normal citizens, we're bringing you some of our favourite interviews from this year's archive, the discussions we've had on this, our rocket of right thinking, our flying refuge of reasoned views. In May, after Keir Starmer's EU reset, we invited Planet Normal's stowaway Lord David Frost onto the rocket. The former diplomat turned Boris Johnson's chief Brexit negotiator now sits as a Conservative in the House of Lords. With a degree from Oxford in French and history, David Frost had a long Foreign Office career, becoming ambassador to Denmark and then private secretary to the head of the diplomatic service. He also served in the political trenches during the Brexit wars, of course, after the 2016 vote, as plenty of MPs, including some Tories, tried to reverse the referendum result. Lord Frost has since emerged as a leading thinker and power broker, as the Tories try to reinvent themselves. And we started by asking him what he thought of Keir Starmer's efforts to bring post-Brexit Britain back into the orbit of the EU. David, it's great to have you back with us here on Planet Normal.
Great to be here.
The rocket of right thinking.
Absolutely.
So Keir Starmer, he's just done this UK-EU reset. What do you think?
Well, it's even worse than I thought it was going to be honest. I knew it was going to be bad because of the way he approached it. You know, it was obvious that he was going to throw one concession after another out. It was obvious the main aim was just to get closer to the EU, kind of whatever. And he's achieved that. It's bad for the country. But, you know, for those in the Labour Party who just want to get back in the club, this is a good deal for them.
And it strikes me, dynamic alignment. We have to accept the EU's rules with no vote. Doesn't that make life more difficult for us, given that we've got other trade deals which don't allow that?
Well, it does, and this is one of the things that, you know, has yet to come out of this discussion. If we're allowing another country to set our trade rules, then how can we negotiate about those rules with a third country? It makes no sense. We don't have control over them, and the whole point of Brexit was to take back control. So I do worry, actually, this is going to start unravelling some of the trade deals we've already done, the CPTPP, the Pacific one, the Indian one. Who knows? Who knows?
I think, to be fair, Lord Frost to Keir Starmer, he did say he would stop the boats, but we didn't know he meant British fishing boats. He's certainly going to stop those. Just talking about the fishing, which seems to be one of the most contentious issues, it's the case, is it, that by next year we were going to be back to full rights over our own waters. And now he's done this extraordinary thing, supposedly a negotiation, but some would see it as an abject capitulation, which is giving them 12 years. Is that correct?
That's right. So we agreed that we would get back full rights over our waters in June next year, in 2026. And meanwhile, we got 25% extra quota. So fishermen got something pending that. And now all that's been lost. That 26 date has been moved out to 2038, well beyond the kind of investment cycles of, you know, fishing boats and so on. So it's very difficult to see how the industry, you know, really gets going after this, because, you know, they know they can't increase the size of the catch, they can't increase the size of the market, they know the terms are set. Why are people going to invest in boosting the British fish industry after this?
Is it also the case, coming back slightly to what Liam was talking about, which is that should a reform government get in 2029 and they say, right, we're not having this fishing deal, are we then bound, you know, in that EU tentacles to pay something to get out of it, or does it then become difficult for a right-wing government to come in and reverse it again?
Well, that's one of the things that we can't be 100% clear how that would work. So we don't have a legal text. We've only got like a political agreement saying this is going to happen. You know, we have to see how Labour actually negotiated. Do they negotiate a withdrawal clause that allows us to do it or not? If they don't, and I wouldn't be surprised if they don't, then we just have to do it anyway. And, you know, there'll be another sort of round of retaliation or whatever. But nevertheless, it's necessary. And that's why I think it's so important that both Reform Reform and Kemi actually have said they will reverse this deal. We need to make that clear now so we have the moral authority when we come back to it in 4 years.
When you hear broadcasters talk about this deal and EU, UK shenanigans in general, they always talk about the fishing industry with a kind of disdain as, oh, it's only a small part of the economy. Actually, these fishing communities, they support huge coastal areas, and some of the worst poverty in this country, I'm right in saying, is just inland from what were once thriving fishing communities.
That's right.
So it's completely wrong. And, Labour are going to get absolutely hammered in the West Country now and up on the east coast of Scotland. It's as if they don't care. And you get kind of snorting posh broadcasters saying, oh, it comes down to the price of fish, as long as we get our pet passports. I mean, for God's sake, I literally chucked something at the radio hearing the coverage when the deal was announced. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other aspects of the deal. Defence procurement. It looks as if the UK is going to have to pay in order to tender for defence procurement. Do we really have to do that? If we've got the best companies, if they need our stuff that's generated by our world-class high-tech arms industry, then surely they should buy it anyway.
Well, it sounds like we're going to have to pay. I mean, that's what you might think in a kind of normal business environment, that you would just contract and tender and that's how it would be done. But no, the EU set up their own scheme. They're borrowing to fund it. I don't know how that, whether we'll have to take on some of that liability as well. And we're going to have to pay in. That's clear from what EU member states have said. And that really could be quite a lot of money.
And how much of a disaster is it that in the fine print, we seem to have signed deals that undermine other deals? We could be sued, couldn't we? The country could be sued because we're violating the terms of the, as you called it earlier, the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, one of the biggest trading blocs in the world, set to be bigger than the EU in just a few years' time. And it's my understanding, David, that you're more expert than me, that any deepening now of the US trade deal is also jeopardized by these dynamic alignment rules.
Yeah, it certainly is, because, one of the things the Americans most want out of a trade deal with us is more agricultural access. The big problem with that is EU rules on agriculture, where we've just signed up to them and we can't change them.
And they're massively protectionist, of course.
Exactly.
Europe's very, very powerful agricultural lobby.
So how are we going to negotiate? And I just don't see that. And it's interesting. I had expected that they would have lined up, the government would have lined up people, spokesmen from some of the CPTPP countries, maybe from India, maybe elsewhere, saying, we're fine with this deal, it doesn't affect it. I haven't heard any of that. And it does make me wonder what they're thinking.
We're all three of us battle-scarred veterans of the Brexit wars, aren't we? And it did make me feel, what's the opposite of nostalgic? It made me remember. Do you remember when David Cameron went off to Europe with his little begging cap?
Yeah.
And was going to come back from Denmark and wherever else he went with all this proof that these nice Europeans were going to really give us special terms to not vote, leave. He basically came back with, you can pay us more money, for which would be marginally less horrible to you, I think. It was basically the arrangement. So this thing, David, they're not calling it freedom of movement, God forbid, but youth experience scheme, even though youth goes up to 30, which many of us don't think of that as children. So youth experience sounds nice and wholesome, doesn't it? All these lovely Italian kids from Perugia coming over and spending a bit of money in the British Museum. What struck me immediately, being a sort of cynical old Brexit warrior, was that Angela Merkel let 1 million Syrians into Germany. So any Syrian in Germany or Turkish person who's aged under 30 could just come across to us on the youth experience scheme, and Germany and other countries now want to get rid of their migrants. So is that likely that we'll end up with loads of those here?
Once again, we've got to see the terms, but it's definitely a risk. Many of those Syrians and others will have got German nationality by now, or German travel rights, and we won't have a basis to exclude them if the deal allows for it. I find it very strange, I must admit, that the government's willing to go down this road. I mean, it's a time when even Keir Starmer has clocked that we do need to get immigration down somewhat, that he's just agreed to this, tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 plus.
Well, they're not saying this at the moment. He's saying no cap, isn't he? But What does that mean? Do they, presumably the EU doesn't want a cap?
Yeah, he said in the House yesterday, I think, that there would be a cap, but the text doesn't say there'll be a cap. It just says the number has to be agreed by both sides, acceptable to both sides. Well, we just discovered that 12 years fish transition was acceptable to the UK. We agreed it. That's not the same. So these things are not the same thing.
We only knew about it at the very last minute.
We
didn't
did.
We?
We only knew on Saturday night. That's what I'm told.
And at a time when we have a lot of our own
What?
young people are unemployed.
That is
So
the
are we
other
going to have
issue.
lots of, I'm not decrying it, because in some ways mobility of young people is great, but what we could be looking at is jobs are scarce. Liam and I often talk on the podcast, we're seeing a lot of hospitality vacancies, for example, going down. So my kids,
We only talk on the podcast, not in real life. She doesn't like me in real life.
No, I don't know. No. Yeah. But that we then see some of our own young people competing with kids from Europe.
After all, that is one of our biggest problems, that young people can't get onto the labour market, won't come onto the labour market for whatever reason. So what do? We make it more difficult by importing, a lot of Europeans. It's not so much the principle, although I don't like the principle, but really is it the moment? It just isn't the moment for this scheme.
Tin-eared at best.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how the Tories should respond to this Brexit renegotiation as we move into talking about the Tories in general. Kemi Badenoch, she might be a bit worried about making the Tories look as if they're a bit deranged, going on and on about Brexit, banging on about Europe, as David Cameron once famously said. What would you advise her to do now?
So I think she needs to do more than she's done already, to be honest. She said
in response to this deal.
In response to this deal and generally on European policy. I mean, she said she will reverse this deal. Good. What we need to do is reverse more than that, reverse some of the kind of underlying dynamics that's led to the problems we've got. And in particular, she needs to say we're going to go back to the Windsor Framework, the Northern Ireland arrangements, and get rid of them as well by negotiation if we can, unilaterally if we can't. Because the big problem that those generate is that because Northern Ireland's part of the single market for goods, part of EU customs, every time we change our rules in GB, it opens the gap between GB and Northern Ireland. So there's this tremendous pressure just to stick with EU arrangements all the time to avoid that gap opening up.
As the EU planned all along, right?
Absolutely.
When you were negotiating with them. This was a raw point and they wanted to rub salt into that wound, if you like.
Totally. Let's not forget, the BBC catching on camera somebody in the team saying we've now got our first colony of the Northern Ireland deal.
That's right.
That's
right.
really how it is. So I know it's awkward. I know, there's weariness about it. I know people in Britain often don't like thinking about Northern Ireland and see it all a bit complicated and difficult. But either this is one country governed by UK laws or it isn't. And at the moment, it isn't. And I don't think that's a stable situation. So she needs to start talking about it and getting people.
Do you think she's got the guts to do that? Do you think she's got the guts to reopen the Windsor Framework?
Well, I hope so. She voted against one of its pieces of secondary legislation a few months back, but more recently she said she doesn't think it's a priority when she went to Northern Ireland. So I don't know, as with so much else.
Coming to the actual state of the Tory party, one of your former ministerial colleagues said to me after that drubbing at the general election, yes, Alison, we lost badly, but maybe not badly enough. And I'm not going to give much away there.
Coy.
She said they still haven't learnt. There's still a kind of arrogant, just obliviousness. And I recall, absolutely astonishingly, this is part of my, David, actually, I should say to Planet Normal listeners that Lord Frost has accused me of being a bit too reformy recently, which we'll come on to. But you were not even considered suitable to be a candidate for the Conservative Party at the general election, presumably being a bit dangerously far right.
Yeah.
David, let's be honest, shall we? Because Conservatives are staring down the barrel of oblivion, I think. Have they learnt the lesson, or are they still doing this, if we'd only been a bit more unified, lots of people would have voted for us?
I think they still haven't really clocked what the problem is, if I'm honest. I think up till maybe these locals and the latest round of polling, I think the dominant view was just, we just got to wait. It'll come right. People will turn back to us. Labour are terrible. Reform will blow up. It will, we don't really have to do anything. It'll all be okay. I think the locals and then these latest polls that put us fourth are beginning to spook people a bit. And rightly so, in my view. The idea that reform is a wasted vote is no longer true. To the same extent, probably won't be true at all soon. And I must say, I struggle sometimes to see kind of what you get when you vote Conservative. What's the USP? I'm not a lifer Conservative. I only came into it, as you were saying, because I wanted to get Brexit done. For me, the political parties on the right are vehicles for getting the right policies in place. And as soon as they fail to get the right policies in place, well, they become a bit pointless. And, if you're a strong Conservative, you've got reform. If you're a sort of social liberal who doesn't mind high taxes and likes the environment and so on, you've got the Lib Dems. What are you getting with the Conservatives that you don't get with anybody else? And that is their strategic difficulty.
It strikes me that the Tories parliamentary party, they seem to think that the centre ground, the Overton window, if you like, of where the election will be won and lost is somewhere between Ed Davey and Kemi Badenoch. It actually strikes me that where the election will be won and lost, where a lot of the electorate is now, is somewhere between Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage. And I personally think the Tory leader, for all her merits and all her instincts, which I think are very good, she's too concerned about keeping her parliamentary party happy rather than keeping that centre ground of where the electorate is happy, where the Tories are going to win or lose the election between her and Reform. It strikes me that she needs to start saying things that are a lot more reformy and start saying them before Nigel Farage does.
Totally. I think the only future for the Conservative Party is as a strongly conservative, not far right, but strongly, meaningfully principled Conservative Party. And at the moment, nobody can see that, partly because we don't say it, and partly because, we've got a substantial contingent in the party.
She's petrified of the parliamentary party having rows with itself. And that's why she's constantly mollifying Tory MPs who are actually Lib Dems.
I think so. And the row has got to come. The thing I hear most from potential reform voters and people I talk to is, why should we believe you this time? You had 14 years. Look at what you did. What a mess it was mostly. Why should we believe you this time? And until we get rid of some of the people who are responsible for some of those errors, why should they believe us? I don't know.
I absolutely agree with you, David. And I've been thinking more and more about this because although I have, voted Conservative, I now want our country to be saved. I'm not much bothered about the vehicle. So all the arguments, reforms falling out amongst people and Rupert Lowe and so on, I don't care. I literally want a government that does what the voters have asked it to do. And we are seeing reform now. Astonishing polling numbers, aren't we? Over 30. If they go up, I think, to about 33 or 34, they could be looking at, because it tips then, doesn't it? The first part of the post, we could be looking at a very serious majority. So instead of it being, will the Conservative Party deign to have an electoral pact with reform? It's like, will Nigel Farage do Kemi the favour of saving her a few seats in Sussex? Do you see some sort of pact becoming more and more realistic?
Not in the short run, because I can't see the pressures that generate it. Both sides still think they can win to be the mainstream party of the right, but it is still as a matter of logic, if we go into the election, if the right goes into the election divided, it's going to lose. That's just inevitable. Therefore, either one party has to absorb the other and the other has to disappear, and I think it's an open question now how that plays out, or there has to be some sort of agreement. And if there's a 50-50 split going into the election, then maybe there'll be a pact, and if there's an 80-20 split, perhaps there won't.
Last question, David. Time goes so fast when you're having fun. The Tories don't seem to want you to be a candidate for MP, despite your credentials, despite your appeal to a lot of the electorate, certainly to a lot of Planet Normal listeners. Would you rule out standing for reform?
Oh, I was going to ask that. Oh, he's blushed.
So
I'm
waiting. I think that, as I said, what I want is A last chance, really, for a party on the right that can deliver meaningful right-wing principled policies. I'm not emotionally committed to the Conservatives in the way that others are. I want the party that is going to do the job and get the job done, and let's see how that plays out.
It's not a no. It's not a no.
Lord Frost.
He loves us, really.
The best Frost since the Great Frost, as somebody once
Somebody
said.
once
Who was
said.
that? Thanks a lot for appearing again on Planet Normal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In May this year, I spoke to Andrew Doyle, a playwright, journalist, stand-up comedian and political satirist. Andrew's operated on the media front line also, having hosted his own Free Speech Nation show on GB News and creating the late-night Headliners newspaper review, now sadly discontinued. Andrew also created the fictional social media character Tadania McGrath, which he used to lampoon trans activism and other so-called woke tendencies. Andrew's also a serious scholar, with a doctorate in early Renaissance poetry and an accomplished writer too, with his latest book, The End of Woke, published in May, as we recorded this interview. I began by reminding Andrew Doyle that when his previous book, The New Puritans, came out in 2022, he stated that would be his last word on the culture wars. So my first question in light of his new book was to ask him what had changed.
Yeah, I was absolutely convinced it would be. But of course, what happened was an awful lot, actually, over the few years following 2022, but following that publication of that book. And my initial idea was to maybe reissue the paperback with a new introduction that sort of brought people up to speed. And I soon realised there's just too much has happened. The world's gone even crazier than anyone anticipated in 2022. So it had to be a whole other book, I'm afraid. But this will be the last word, my last word on the culture war. That's my hope. That's why I've called it The End of Woke. It's more a kind of optimistic way so that I don't have to write another one. That's what I'm thinking.
I'm a kind of, an observer of the woke debate, of course. We deal with these kind of issues on Planet Normal tangentially. It's hard to ignore them. Anyone that's interested in journalism, in free speech and society as a whole.
Yes.
And I kind of figured that someone soon would write a book, The End of Woke, because I watched the Cass report happen. I watched Wes Streeting come in and really change his tune and outlaw the use of puberty blockers, certainly within the NHS. I watched Donald Trump, a Republican president, sign those executive orders. Just talk Planet Normal's audience through that. Why you think the end of woke is accelerating and what really drove you to write this book now?
Yeah, it's very interesting you mentioned that because, I think these woke issues affect everyone and sometimes whether people realise it or not. It's absolutely everywhere. But the signs are all there, exactly as you say. So many kind of seismic moments have occurred over the last couple of years, which have really accelerated what I think is the death of woke in terms of the death of whatever woke was over the last 15 years. We can come on to what might happen next. But if you think about the various things that have happened, you've got Donald Trump signing this slew of executive orders, many of which are about preserving women's rights. The idea of no men in women's prisons, no men in women's sports, that kind of thing. This is a man who's been accused repeatedly of misogyny, but he's signing these orders to protect some of the most pro-feminist orders that any president has signed. So that's all happened over in America. And at the same time, you've had the stripping back of DEI policies, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies throughout the corporate sector, throughout the corporate world. Companies such as McDonald's and Walmart and Google and Facebook have all stripped all of this back in a very rapid time frame. And then at the same time, you've had, as you mentioned, the Cass review, which pointed out through 4 years of rigorous study that there is no evidence for the efficacy of puberty blockers for gender-confused children, resulting in Wes Streeting doing an about turn on his position on this, the banning of puberty blockers wholesale in the UK, something which will doubtless trickle out globally. And, of course, very recently, we've had the Supreme Court ruling clarifying that in the Equality Act, the word sex means biological sex and that cannot change, even if you have a certificate that creates the legal fiction that you are the opposite sex. So all of this stuff, these things were sort of unimaginable if you go back 5-6 years, and particularly to that moment in 2020, in the summer of 2020, when wokeness hit its peak following the death of George Floyd and the pandemic and the lockdowns. And you had
the Black Lives Matter movement, and you
Exactly.
had Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner taking the knee. You had police taking the knee when faced with some pretty belligerent protesters and so on.
Yes, and it really did escalate. Of course, since then, many key figures in the Black Lives Matter movement have been completely discredited. You know, many of the leaders of various chapters of BLM were found to have taken a lot of that money that was donated by people in good faith and bought luxury properties. Millions and millions of dollars. We've also seen the Chicago chapter of BLM putting out a pro-Palestine message on social media, which included an image of one of the terrorists from the 7th of October 2023, one of the paragliders. So, and a lot
Beyond
of
the pale. Completely beyond the pale.
So people have woken up to it. So all of that, and also the Economist did a study about this, which I quote in the book, about how wokeness sort of really kicked off in 2015, peaked around 2020, and has been declining ever since. And that decline, as far as I can see, is now pretty much terminal, based on the factors I've just mentioned, and even the little things, you know, like arch leftists like Ocasio-Cortez, you know, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Pete
AOC,
Buttigieg.
as she's known, very
AOC.
left-wing US Democrat politician.
People like her have been taking their pronouns out of their social media bios, just doing it on the quiet, not making too much of a fuss about it, sometimes claiming it was a mistake. I noticed that Sadiq Khan removed his pronouns, and then there was a backlash, and he put them back in and said it was just some kind of typo, as though someone hadn't deliberately gone into his account.
Pathetic.
You know, it's absolutely pathetic.
Do it or don't do it. God.
Yeah. But, you know, what I would say is all of this stuff suggests that woke is dying in its current form. The title of the book, The End of Woke, there's a kind of implied question mark there, but also it's a kind of aspiration rather than a prophecy. I'm not positioning myself as a kind of Nostradamus figure, because I'd definitely get it wrong if I tried. So that's where I'm coming from. I think all the signs are there. You know, we can hear all the death rattles. I don't think that woke as we knew it is going to come back. I think it's done a lot of damage. And I think that's why we're sort of staggering through the debris of this culture war now, trying to sort of restore sanity. And that process will take a while, many years probably, but at least all of the key factors of woke are being sort of gradually discredited and leaving us with some semblance of normality.
A lot of these things come from the US, don't they? I know you're a very keen observer of the US, as am I. I know you're now living in the US a lot of the time, but it really struck me in your book where just as a lot of these kind of woke tendencies came from America, I think the end of woke has come from America too. When you wrote Trump's victory over Kamala Harris shows that woke can win and lose elections, and the Republicans came up with a really, really penetrating campaign slogan, Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you. And I think it was one of the most effective political slogans of all time, really tapping into how ordinary Americans feel, because even though so many of our media and political institutions and our corporations have slavishly pandered to this stuff, both in the States and here, the vast majority of people, ordinary people, have never had any truck with it at all. Repeated polls show that, and Trump really tapped into that.
Absolutely. That's why I've very little time for the argument that the culture war is imaginary, that it doesn't have anything to do with politics or elections. Actually, the culture war wins and loses elections. And we've seen that time and again. I mean, we saw, even if you go back to Hillary Clinton, I mean, when she lost, she had very much positioned herself as a candidate that would appeal to various demographics according to group identity, and that completely backfired. The example you mentioned, I mean, Kamala Harris had specifically said that prison inmates who identified as transgender should have access to surgery. That was what the advert, Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you. That's how that came about. And the group Future Forward, which was a Democratic Party group, and not a fan of Trump, admitted that advertisement triggered a 2.7 shift in favour of Trump among
absolutely
people who saw
seismic in an election that was on a
Huge.
knife edge until that point.
Exactly.
It probably delivered him his so-called triple victory, didn't it? Because he won the electorate, he won the majority vote, if you like. He won in the Senate, and he won in the Electoral College as well.
Exactly. The leader of the free world is there quite explicitly on an anti-woke mandate. Now, that means it does matter. And we can pretend it doesn't matter all we like. And, you know, you've had various columnists saying, if you just ignore this, it'll go away. I know Matthew Parris made that point.
Insane.
It's just not true.
He's a really bright man.
it's
I've got a lot of respect for him and his writing. I mean,
So do
what's
I.
happened?
Yeah, so do I.
When really, really smart people, very politically astute, obviously worked at the top of politics, worked closely with Margaret Thatcher. Why?
Well, it's like when people say, cancel culture doesn't exist. And, in my book, as you know, I've deliberately listed sort of a long list of examples of people who've had reputations and livelihoods destroyed simply for saying things that we all know to be true. So, the denial is something that I think is very aggravating for people, because obviously there's been a culture war. Obviously, wokeness has prevailed in all of the major institutions, whether it be political or corporate or in the media or in the arts, where it completely reigns. So we can all see this. But you see, we've been constantly told that this stuff isn't real, that we're just imagining it. The phrase they use is gaslighting, But of course it's real. And of course it's destroyed lives. I mean, the woke movement has utterly destroyed individuals. We had, in this country, the NHS medicalising young people who were gender non-conforming, kids who weren't adhering to outmoded 1950s stereotypes of what it meant to be male or female. They were being told they had a gendered soul and that they needed their body to be realigned to match that gendered soul. This is complete pseudoscience. It was, let's be honest, a kind of gay conversion therapy, because we know that between 80 and 90% of adolescents referred to the Tavistock Paediatric Clinic were same-sex attracted. That was confirmed by Hannah Barnes' study into the Tavistock Clinic. That is, in other words, fixing, heterosexualizing kids, almost certainly likely, most of whom will grow up to be gay. Yeah. That is the kind of gay conversion therapy that the mullahs of Tehran would absolutely applaud, but it was going on the NHS. To say none of this matters, it must be either willfully blind, or it might be to do with the fact that woke ideologues are so scary. I mean, they're frightening people. You want to put them on a leash. They're terrifying. And if people speak out about this, I mean, we've had a situation, if you think about it, Liam, for the past 10 years, where people have been scared to say online that no human being has ever changed sex, which is a matter of incontestable fact. Yeah. But we've been expected to say phrases like trans women are women. In other words, 2 + 2 = 5. And if we don't go along with that, we're monstered and demonized. And there is a genuine risk that people lose their careers. So to say it's not there...
Well, look at Robert Winston. Look at Robert Winston, one of the most respected sort of TV scientists, if you like. He's now a member of the House of Lords. Labour peer. He's basically banned from the BBC for years because he said it on Question Time. Do you remember?
I remember.
He said on Question Time, you cannot change sex. And everyone went, oh my God.
Yes.
And he literally has barely been on the telly since.
Fiona Bruce.
A brilliant man that we grew up with.
Yes, and you have the host sort of saying, well, a lot of people would find that offensive, etc. I mean, it's like he's just stated the existence of gravity. Yeah. And people reacted in horror. Well, because it is the woke movement was always rooted in these sort of quite quasi-religious ideas. And it became a kind of heresy to dissent. We're emerging from that now. I mean, I think one of the reasons why We're Streeting has had such a turnaround on this is that...
Health Secretary, of course.
The Health Secretary. Is that he has sat down and spoken to various campaign groups. He's talked to, I don't know exactly who he's spoken to, but people like Sex Matters and people like LGB Alliance who are explaining why women's rights and gay rights are predicated on the recognition that biological sex is real. Yeah. And you can't really, once you've had that debate, once you've had that discussion, it's almost impossible actually to come out with any other conclusion than the truth. This is why, of course, when Stonewall, which is what used to be the country's foremost gay charity, and veered into trans ideology around 2015, their mantra has been no debate. They've said we're not debating this, because if you debate, you lose. If you have an insecure position like that, like, sex is a spectrum, sex doesn't exist, and also we should reorganize society according to some esoteric notion of a gendered soul rather than the reality of sexual difference and sexual dimorphism. You're onto a losing battle there, aren't you? If you actually allow the discussion. It's why people like Nadia Whittome in the Labour Party called debate a fetish. She said we mustn't fetishize debate. She's one of those who bought in wholesale.
And she's been elected to the mother of all parliaments. And she said, let's not fetishize debate.
Exactly. Well, what are you doing in Parliament then?
Absolutely
what are you doing
mad.
in the House of Commons then?
Absolutely mad. Absolutely mad. What advice would you have, Andrew, for opposition MPs, given that woke can win or lose elections, given, as you demonstrate, woke in some ways delivered Trump his second term in the White House? Kemi Badenoch's got a good track record on this, of course. She commissioned the Cass review. I know the people around her and they're nervous about always being involved with these culture war issues. What would you say to her? What would be your advice under this heading?
I would say, firstly, don't be afraid of addressing these issues. You can ignore the people who say it doesn't matter. You can ignore what you can say is you can look at the statistics. More in Common initiative, who I quote in the book, they found that in the UK, it's only 8%, roughly between 8 and 10% of the country have supported woke ideas at any given time, at its height, in fact. And then what that means is that woke has never been popular with the electorate. And not only that, it's never been popular with any age bracket in the electorate. This has been a top-down ideology imposed by elites. It has a tendency, it works kind of like a virus, and it captures positions of power in government and in quangos and in the NHS and in the police. Look at the College of Policing. I mean, the College of Policing is now a kind of activist body that trains police officers in England and Wales, and it introduced that notion of non-crime hate incidents back in 2015.
Which, of course, are close to Alison's heart.
Well, of course, exactly. And that was introduced without a government mandate. There have since been 2 Home Secretaries that have told them, you cannot do this, stop it, and they ignored them. The High Court said, you cannot do this, stop it. They ignored the High Court because activist capture is very real. And so I would say to politicians, just remember how deeply unpopular these woke initiatives are with the general public. So if you want to win elections, we're in a democracy after all, then take a firm stance against it, because ultimately it will be a pleaser. Well, the problem you're going to get is that people in positions of power are going to tell you that you have to go along with this stuff. Let's not forget, for all the culture war has been misunderstood as left versus right, the worst excesses of the woke movement were presided over by the Tories in their tenure. So this is something that...
They set up the College of Policing, didn't they?
They did. They absolutely. So it's not something that can be... you can't vote it out. If it captures both major political parties, this was something that was never there because of a democratic mandate. And so it's been hard to get rid of. And the way it's dying now is, well, partly through Trump. I mean, that kind of revolution there in America. We don't have that equivalent yet here. But also just having the argument, having the discussion, and having politicians within those major parties, people like Kemi, people like Wes Streeting, who have the guts to say, actually, this is wrong. And that's what I would say, because I know politicians are always after the vote, aren't they? This is a popular thing to do. And it's not frivolous. If you speak to people whose lives have been ruined by this,
so many ordinary working people, so many ordinary working, men, particularly white men, feel that their careers are being constrained. They're not getting jobs because of this stuff. Sort of DEI on speed is really working against meritocracy. There's so many things I want to ask you, Andrew, and we're rapidly running out of time. I have to ask you just briefly, what do you think of the Lucy Connolly case? And why is it that you think Keir Starmer, as you've said, is authoritarian?
Well, as you know, I've written about the Lucy Connolly case in the book, and I know that Allison, of course, has been very close to this. She's been just the best on this topic. The problem here is manifold, but let's start with the point that the police and the government, the state, should not be auditing people's emotions, their speech and their thoughts. This was a tweet that was written hastily and deleted almost as quickly, just after a few hours. I know of nobody who defends the content of the tweet. I don't know anyone who says, I support what she said. The point isn't that. The point is that it doesn't, by any sensible definition of the term, qualify as incitement to violence. We in this country...
Do you think politicians put their finger on the scales of justice? You're a very experienced guy in the public sphere. You're politically extremely astute in my experience. Do you think that happened?
Yes, I think it was unofficial pressure. Keir Starmer appeared on television and said, I'm expecting substantive sentences by the end of the week.
Yeah.
When the Prime Minister does that, there is some kind of unofficial pressure being applied. And we know that it happened because various judges in various of these cases who were meting out draconian jail terms for tweets and memes. I mean, there was even that guy who got 8 weeks in prison for memes that, as far as I can see, don't even meet the threshold of hate speech, whatever the hell that is.
Just to explain, a meme is like a sort of a little kind of cartoony thing on social media with a little slogan.
Yeah, it's an online image. I mean, the worst of the 3 memes that this guy posted was an image of immigrants with the slogan, coming to a town near you. I think immigrants with knives or something. Now, you might say that's unpleasant. You might say it's needlessly provocative. The idea that that should be illegal is terrifying to me, because Keir Starmer sat there in the Oval Office and said, we have a very proud history of free speech in this country. Yeah, history, because we don't have it anymore. No one should be in prison for something they say. In America, firstly, they have the First Amendment, which protects them to a degree. They also have a sensible definition in law of incitement to violence, which is known as the Brandenburg test. And the key aspects of the Brandenburg test are that if there was an intention to incite violence, that violence was likely to occur due to the language, and that there was an imminent threat of violence. In none of those three criteria does Lucy Connolly's case apply. It was just an angry tweet written by someone thoughtlessly, rash in the moment, deleted. No violence occurred as a result of that tweet, and no violence could ever have occurred as a result of that tweet, because Lucy Connolly wasn't someone in a position of power. She wasn't some political leader. She had zero clout. And we know that the public doesn't act on cue according to stuff they consume in the media, whether that be in books or film or now online and on social media. So there was never any risk. She has been made an example of. And what troubled me as well in that case, the judge in the case made a specifically political statement in his judgment. He said, this is a country that has always valued diversity and inclusion. That's hat-tipping to DEI. That's explicitly ideological. There's no getting around that. So that means that has, by his own admission, influenced the decision in some way or another. Now, all of this is very, very troubling. There's a man called Philip Prescott, who you will have heard of, who was sentenced to 28 months in prison for actually being part of a mob that physically attacked a mosque. Why is it that someone like Lucy Connolly talking about burning down a hotel is sentenced to longer than a man who actually physically attacks a mosque? That doesn't make any sense at all, but it makes complete sense when you understand that the woke ideology has infected our judicial system and our policing system, because they believe that words trump violence, that words are a form of violence and are actually sometimes worse than violence. These are postmodernists. They believe that our entire understanding of reality is constructed through language, and therefore censorship is the key to a cohesive society. Control what people say, and therefore you can sort out all of society's problems. That's their view.
That is literally Orwellian, isn't it? And you write
Yes.
about Orwell a lot in the book. I have to say, you're a man of many hats. You're obviously a stand-up comic. You created the incredibly successful Twitter account to Tardy McCraw, completely hilarious way of lampooning woke, way ahead of your time. You're a political street fighter. You got a doctorate in Renaissance poetry from Oxford. And I felt reading the book, as I said to you, I read it very, very quickly because it was such a good read, that there's endless references to Orwell, to John Milton, all kinds of philosophical references that you bring in. But just finally, please tell listeners of Planet Normal the incredible story of J.K. Chesterton and the Flying In. It's as if he wrote it last week.
Oh, absolutely. So, well, this is a novel that was written in 1914. And the thing is, I've spoken to fans of G.K. Chesterton who don't know.
We are the people of England, of course, and we haven't spoken yet. It's probably his most famous quote.
Right. People don't know of this novel. It's one of those that, you know how when someone is so prolific, they write many novels and occasionally one of them just slips onto the net. So Chesterton wrote this book, The Flying In 1914. It is a tale about a future Islamic England. It's a story about an imam called the Prophet of the Moon, comes to the UK and manages to influence a major political figure, a man called Lord Ivywood, who's very powerful in Parliament. It's a bit hazy on the details of how this works, but effectively what happens for the comic premise.
It's a farce, isn't it? None of them can get a drink.
It's really, really silly. It's about how, because of the Islamic Sharia codes, no one can get a drink. Everyone's got to be teetotal. And these two guys discover a loophole in the law whereby you can sell beer if you've got the inn sign. So they run around the country on the back of a donkey with their barrels of beer and a wheel of cheese. And they plant their inn sign at various places, hence the Flying In, sell their beer and move on. So I have to be clear, it's a satire. It's foolish, it's farcical, it's funny. But the point of it is he's talking about what happens when people in positions of power allow in deeply illiberal qualities into their democracy. It's a satire really on Lord Ivywood and that kind of politician.
And they kowtow because they don't want to cause offence.
Well, he's like the prototype of the virtue signaller.
Yeah.
He's, in the book, he says how he did not care for dogs, but he cared for the cause of dogs. It's things like that. And it's through the stupidity of the ruling class. That's what Chesterton really satirizes. He has this imam, this Prophet of the Moon, having these events in the London circuit of socialites. And there's a group called the Society of Simple Souls, just these posh upper middle class political people who love him and bring him in. And they say,
written last week. It's absolute genius.
Well, we've got, over 80 Sharia courts in this country. We have halal
and no one
meat.
wants to talk about it. No one wants to talk about it.
So it's funny that this book, written over 100 years ago, I mean, it's incredible to think about it, imagines this future Islamic England. It does it through the lens of comedy, but it has a lot to say. There's really silly things like Parliament votes to change the voting system so you don't put a cross in the polling booth, you put a crescent, so it's more Islamic than Christian. Silly things like that. But I think it's prescient. I think there's all sorts of ways in which we've allowed a kind of parallel system through this creed of multiculturalism to flourish. And that is exactly what Chesterton is satirising in The Flying Inn. It's well worth a read.
Jesters do oft prove prophets.
They do.
As we read in King Lear. I can't match you for literary references, Andrew. It's a fabulous book. I can't recommend it highly enough. And it's indeed published today, the 29th of May, as Planet Normal is released. Andrew Doyle, the author of The End of Woke. Thanks so much for appearing once again on the Rocket of Right Thinking.
Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us for this latest edition of Planet Normal. Allison and I will be back with the very latest news and views from beyond the bubble on Thursday the 4th of September. In the meantime, keep the emails rolling in to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk.
If you enjoy Planet Normal, jolly well hope you do, please subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen. It really does help others to find us.
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the madness of Planet Earth comes back into view, thanks as ever to our producers, Cass Ho, James Hodgson, and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other until next time. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.